Kang Joon-Hyuk had just pulled 2 children back from death. The freezing harbor water clawed at his body as he dragged the twins onto the shore. His soaked suit heavy enough to drown a lesser man. Saving lives wasn't who he was. Mercy wasn't part of his world. Because Kang Joon-Hyuk wasn't a hero. He was the Dragon King, Korea's most feared mafia boss. A man whose name ended wars, whose enemies disappeared without graves, and who swore long ago that family would never become his weakness. But the moment the children looked at him, his world stopped. They didn't cry for help. They didn't thank him. The little girl stared into his face, trembling lips parting in recognition. Daddy! The word hit harder than the icy water. Joon-Hyuk froze, his blood turning to ice in a way the harbor water never could. He didn't breathe, didn't move. For the first time in his ruthless life, the Dragon King stood completely powerless. Your daddy? The boy whispered, gripping his sleeve. Mummy shows us your picture every night. She said you were a king. And just like that, the past he buried came rushing back. Behind him, 5 black SUVs screeched to a halt as armed men flooded the harbor, forming a protective wall around their boss. But Joon-Hyuk barely noticed, because rescue teams were pulling another body from the water. She was pale, unconscious, and half dead, but she was unmistakable. Naomi, the woman who had vanished years ago to keep his children away from his bloodstained world. Joon-Hyuk realized in that moment that he hadn't just saved 2 strangers. He had just rescued the only thing in this world that could actually destroy him. The twins he had just saved. But before we see what happens when the Dragon King has to face his past, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I truly love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. And if you're already hooked on this reveal, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you know. Now, let's begin. The roar of the storm was a deafening wall of sound, but it couldn't drown out the high-pitched, jagged scream that sliced through the salt air. Kang Joon-Hyuk was standing on the edge of the private pier, his hand hovering over the cold steel of the railing. Just moments ago, he had been the apex predator in a room full of sharks, concluding a deal that would consolidate his grip on the shipping lanes of Busan. He was a man who dealt in numbers, in territories, and in the cold finality of lead. He wasn't a man who felt feelings. Yet, as the ferry in the distance lurched, its hull groaning under the weight of a rogue wave, something inside his chest snapped. It was a physical sensation, like a wire being pulled taut until it vibrated against his ribs. His second-in-command, Min-ho, was mid-sentence, detailing the logistics of their next shipment, but Joon-Hyuk wasn't listening. His dark eyes were locked on a splash of bright color against the churning, charcoal-gray water. 2 small orange life vests bobbing precariously in the wake of the listing vessel. Boss? The documents are ready for. Min-ho never finished the sentence. Joon-Hyuk didn't hesitate. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't kick off his shoes. He moved with a predatory grace that turned into an explosive dive, his body cutting through the air like a blade before disappearing into the churning maw of the harbor. The impact was a shock of absolute zero. The water wasn't just cold. It was violent. It rushed into his ears and nose, the weight of his charcoal wool suit immediately doubling as it soaked through, dragging him down toward the lightless depths. Under the surface, everything was a chaotic swirl of silt and bubbles, but Joon-Hyuk's eyes remained open, stinging from the salt as he searched for those flashes of orange. He breached the surface, gasping for air that was more spray than oxygen. The current here, near the mouth of the harbor, was a monster. It wanted to sweep him out toward the open sea, away from the 2 small figures that were being pulled into the deadly white water created by the ferry's propellers. "Hold on," he roared, though the wind snatched the words from his lips before they could travel a yard. He kicked with every ounce of strength in his legs, his muscles screaming against the sudden, intense exertion. He was a man who exercised for combat, for the endurance required to survive a night of gang warfare, but this was different. This was a race against the clock of a child's lungs. He reached the first child, a boy, Noah. The boy was barely above water, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as he swallowed mouthfuls of the briny deep. Joon-Hyuk reached out a massive, scarred hand and snagged the back of the life vest, hauling the boy toward him. "I've got you. Stop fighting," Joon-Hyuk commanded, his voice a low, commanding vibration that seemed to penetrate the boy's panic. But there was a second one. Nia. She was 5 feet further out, caught in a swirling eddy that was dragging her closer to the churning metal of the sinking ferry's hull. Joon-Hyuk tucked Noah under his left arm, the boy clutching at his soaked shirt with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. With only one arm free, Joon-Hyuk's progress slowed. Every stroke was a battle. The salt water burned his throat, and the weight of the waterlogged suit felt like a tombstone tied to his back. He could see Nia's eyes wide, dark, and searching. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was too tired. She was sinking. "Not on my watch," Joon-Hyuk growled internally. The Dragon King didn't lose. He didn't lose territory, he didn't lose wars, and he was not going to lose these children to the sea. With a roar of pure defiance, he lunged through a breaking wave, his fingers brushing against Nia's tiny hand before closing firmly around her waist. He pulled her in, locking her against his right side. Now he was a man anchored by 2 lives, his arms full, his legs the only things keeping them from the abyss. The swim back to the shore was an eternity of agony. His heart felt like it was going to burst through his chest wall. Every time a wave crashed over them, he used his own body as a shield, arching his back to take the brunt of the water so the twins wouldn't be submerged again. He could feel their small hearts racing against his ribs, fast, frantic thumps that felt hauntingly familiar, though he couldn't place why. The shore was a jagged line of rocks and mud, illuminated by the flashing lights of his own security detail, who had finally realized what their boss had done. Min-ho was at the water's edge, screaming orders, but to Joon-Hyuk, it was all background noise. The only thing that mattered was the weight in his arms. His knees finally hit the mud. It was soft and treacherous, but it was solid ground. He crawled the last few feet, his breath coming in ragged, broken sobs as he dragged the twins onto the grass, away from the reaching fingers of the tide. He collapsed onto his side, his lungs burning as if he had swallowed fire. Beside him, the twins lay on the grass, coughing and heaving up salt water. The boy, Noah, was the first to find his breath, his small frame shaking with violent tremors. Nia was silent, her eyes fixed on the man who had just pulled her from the dark. Joon-Hyuk lay there, the rain washing the salt from his face, his vision blurred. He watched his men approach, the black suits, the guns, the cold efficiency of his world. He expected to feel the usual ice in his veins, the desire to stand up and reassert his dominance. Instead, he felt a strange, hollow ache. He turned his head to look at the girl. She was shivering, her wet hair plastered to her forehead. She reached out a small, trembling hand and touched the sleeve of his ruined suit. Her eyes weren't filled with the fear he usually saw when people looked at the Dragon King. They were filled with a haunting recognition. "Are you okay?" Joon-Hyuk managed to rasp out, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. It was soft. It was concerned. It was a voice he hadn't used in years. The girl didn't answer with a yes or no. She stared at his face, at the sharp jawline and the cold eyes that were currently softened by exhaustion. She looked at the way the light caught the dark, wet hair on his brow. Behind them, the rescue teams were finally arriving, their sirens wailing in the distance, but the harbor seemed to fall into a vacuum of silence. Joon-Hyuk pushed himself up onto one elbow, looking down at the 2 children he had nearly died to save. He wondered for a brief, fleeting second why he had done it. He had no reason to care. He had no stake in these lives. Then the girl spoke. It was a single word, whispered through blue, chattering teeth, yet it carried the force of a landslide. "Daddy!" The world didn't just stop. It fractured. Joon-Hyuk's entire identity, the Dragon King, the ruthless boss, the man who needed no one, was stripped away in a heartbeat. He looked at the boy, who was now nodding, his small hand clenching Joon-Hyuk's wet sleeve as if he would never let go. "You're him," Noah whispered, his voice gaining strength. "Mummy, she showed us your picture. Every night before we went to sleep. She said you were a king who lived across the sea." Joon-Hyuk felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him colder than the harbor water ever could. A king across the sea. The twins weren't just random victims of a ferry accident. They were the living, breathing consequences of a past he had tried to drown in blood and business. He looked toward the water just as the divers pulled a woman onto a stretcher. Even from the distance, even through the rain and the dimming light, he knew the curve of that shoulder. He knew the way her dark hair would look when it was dry and catching the sun. Naomi. She had been the only woman who ever saw the man beneath the Dragon King. And she was the woman he had told, with cold, unwavering certainty, that he would never marry and never father children. He had told her that his world was too dark for a family. He had told her she deserved better than a man who walked with death. And she had listened. She had vanished into the night, taking his heart with her, and, as it turned out, taking his legacy as well. Boss! Min-ho was standing over him now, his face a mask of confusion. The ambulances are here. We need to get you moving. We don't know who else was on that ship. It could be a setup. Joon-Hyuk didn't look at his second-in-command. He didn't look at the guns or the SUVs. He reached out, his large, trembling hand hovering over Nia's head before finally, tentatively, resting on her wet hair. They stay with me, Joon-Hyuk said. His voice was no longer a rasp. It was a decree. It was the voice of a man who had just found a reason to burn the world down, and a reason to build a new one. And their mother, if she doesn't make it, none of you will live to see the sunrise. Do you understand? Min-ho blinked, the cold authority of his boss returning, but with a new, terrifying edge. Yes, boss. Understood. Joon-Hyuk gathered the twins into his arms, one on each side, pulling them into the warmth of his chest. For the first time in his life, the Dragon King wasn't thinking about the next deal or the next war. He was thinking about the two small hearts beating against his own, and the woman on the stretcher who held the answers to the 7 years of silence that had just come to a crashing, watery end. The Dragon King had saved 2 children from the waves, but as he carried them toward the waiting cars, he realized that he was the one who was truly being rescued, and the storm was only just beginning. The silence that followed the word daddy was more violent than the storm that had nearly claimed them. For Kang Joon-Hyuk, the world didn't just slow down. It ceased to exist. The sirens of the approaching ambulances became a muted hum, and the frantic shouting of his subordinates felt like it was coming from another continent. He was a man who moved through life with the precision of a scalpel, always 3 steps ahead of his enemies and 10 steps ahead of his own emotions. But in this moment, on the mud-slicked banks of the harbor, the Dragon King was paralyzed. He looked down at the 2 small souls he had pulled from the abyss. Nia, the girl, was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Yet her eyes, large, dark, and soul-piercingly familiar, never left his. She wasn't looking at him with the terror that usually met a Mafia boss. She was looking at him with the absolute, heartbreaking certainty of a child who had finally found the hero of her bedtime stories. What did you just call me? Joon-Hyuk's voice was a ghost of itself, a raspy thread of sound that barely escaped his throat. Daddy, the boy Noah repeated. He didn't say it as a question this time. He said it as a fact, his small hand tightening its grip on Joon-Hyuk's soaked wool sleeve. The boy's knuckles were white, his frame shaking from the cold, but his gaze was steady. We know it's you. We've known since we were babies. Joon-Hyuk felt a coldness in his marrow that had nothing to do with the harbor water. His mind raced back through the years, through the layers of blood and betrayal he had navigated to reach his throne. 7 years. It had been 7 years since Naomi Carter had walked out of his life. He remembered the last night they spent together in a high-rise in Seoul. The rain had been hitting the windows just like this. He had told her, with a heart he had purposely turned to stone, that there was no room for her in the life he was building. He had told her that the Dragon King didn't have loved ones, only liabilities. He had watched her eyes break that night, but he hadn't moved to comfort her. He had let her leave, thinking he was saving her from the darkness of his world. He had convinced himself that she would find a boring, safe man and live a boring, safe life. He never imagined she was carrying his legacy into the shadows. How? Joon-Hyuk managed to ask, his breath hitching. How could you possibly know who I am? Nia reached into the collar of her wet shirt, pulling out a small, waterproof plastic pouch hanging from a nylon cord. With trembling fingers, she fumbled with the seal until it popped open. She pulled out a crumpled, laminated photograph. Joon-Hyuk took the small piece of plastic, his fingers clumsy and numb. He stared at the image. It wasn't a professional photo. It was a candid shot, taken from a distance. Him standing on a balcony in Jeju, looking out at the ocean, his profile sharp against the setting sun. He remembered that day. It was the only week he had ever allowed himself to be truly happy. Naomi had taken that picture while he wasn't looking. "Mummy told us you were a king," Nia whispered, her voice small but clear against the roar of the wind. "She said you lived in a big castle across the sea and that you were protecting us from the shadows. She showed us the picture every night before we went to sleep. She told us that if we were ever in trouble, the Dragon King would come for us." A sharp, jagged pain lanced through Joon-Hyuk's chest. The Dragon King. To the world, that name was a curse. It was a title associated with extortion, violence, and a grip of iron. But to these children it was a fairy tale. Naomi had taken his most terrifying identity and turned it into a shield of hope for his children. She hadn't taught them to hate the man who abandoned them. She had taught them to wait for him. She told you that? Joon-Hyuk asked, his chest heaving. "She said you had to stay away to keep the monsters from finding us?" Noah added, leaning his head against Joon-Hyuk's shoulder. The boy's warmth began to seep through the wet fabric of Joon-Hyuk's suit. A tiny spark of life that felt more powerful than all the weapons his men were currently aiming at the perimeter. "But I knew you'd find us if the boat sank. I told Nia not to be scared because Daddy is the strongest man in the world." The irony was a bitter pill. Joon-Hyuk had spent his entire life making sure he had no weaknesses, no soft spots, for his enemies to exploit. And yet, here he was, on his knees in the mud, completely undone by 2 3-foot-tall humans who thought he was a hero. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness rise up in him. A primal, ancient instinct that bypassed the cold logic of the Mafia boss and went straight to the soul of the father. "Boss!" Minho's voice broke the trance. His second-in-command was standing 5 feet away, his face a mask of shock and confusion. He had heard the children. Every man in the security detail had heard them. In the world of the Korean syndicate, secrets were more dangerous than bullets, and Joon-Hyuk had just been outed in the most public way possible. "Boss, the paramedics are ready. We need to secure the area. If word of this gets out, if the Kim faction hears there are heirs." Joon-Hyuk's head snapped up. The vulnerability vanished from his eyes, replaced by a killing frost that made Minho take an involuntary step back. The Dragon King was back, but he was different now. He was a predator defending his nest. "If word of this gets out," Joon-Hyuk said, his voice dropping into a low, lethal register that cut through the storm, "I will burn this city to the ground with every one of you inside it. These children are mine. Do you understand? They are the highest priority. Higher than the shipments. Higher than the board members. Higher than me." Minho swallowed hard, bowing his head deeply. "Yes, boss. Understood. The private wing at St. Mary's is being cleared as we speak. No records, no names." Joon-Hyuk turned back to the twins. He reached out and, for the first time, pulled them both into a crushing embrace. He didn't care about the mud, the salt, or the blood on his face. He felt Nia's small arms wrap around his neck, and Noah's forehead rest against his collarbone. "I've got you," Joon-Hyuk whispered into their hair. "The monsters won't get anywhere near you ever again. I promise." But as he held them, his eyes drifted to the pier, where the medical team was performing CPR on a limp, pale figure. Naomi. His heart hammered against his ribs. She had kept his secret for 7 years. She had raised his children in exile, giving them a father they could love instead of the monster the world knew. And she had done it all alone. He realized then that the word that froze time wasn't just daddy. It was a mirror. It was the children showing him exactly what he had thrown away, and what he now had to kill to keep. He had spent years building an empire so he wouldn't have to be afraid. But as he watched the paramedics load Naomi into the ambulance, he felt a fear so intense it threatened to choke him. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He wasn't just a legend. He was a man with a family, and in his world that was a death sentence. "Move out!" Joon-Hyuk roared, standing up with a twin in each arm, his muscles screaming but his will unshakable. He walked toward the line of black SUVs, his gait heavy and determined. He didn't look back at the sinking ferry or the dark water. He looked only at the ambulance carrying the woman he had never stopped loving. The twins clung to him, their small bodies finally starting to warm against his own. They had called him Daddy, and in doing so they had shattered the Dragon King. But as Joon-Hyuk climbed into the back of his armored car, he knew one thing for certain. The world was about to find out exactly how far a father would go to protect his own. The freezing harbor was behind them, but the real storm, the one of fire and vengeance, was just beginning. The sirens roared like wounded beasts as the harbor was flooded with a blinding strobe of red and blue light. Kang Joon-Hyuk stood amidst the chaos, his wet suit plastered to his skin, looking less like a king and more like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. In his arms, the twins were shivering, their small bodies vibrating against his chest as they clung to his neck. He could feel the rhythmic thrum of their heartbeats, fast, panicked, but alive. Every breath they took felt like a miracle he didn't deserve. But his eyes weren't on the children anymore. They were locked on the dark, churning mouth of the harbor where a team of divers was emerging from the froth. They were carrying a stretcher. The movement was frantic, the rescuers shouting over the howl of the wind as they scrambled up the slippery, mud-caked bank. Joon-Hyuk's pulse hammered against his throat. He had spent years imagining this moment. Not this specific tragic scene, but the moment he might see Naomi again. In his dreams, she was always walking away from him under the neon lights of Seoul, her head held high, leaving him to the cold empire he had chosen over her. He had never imagined seeing her like this. Limp, broken, and being fought for by strangers in neon vests. "Mommy!" Nia's voice was a jagged shard of glass, cutting through the heavy air. The little girl lunged toward the stretcher, her small hands reaching out into the rain. Joon-Hyuk tightened his grip, pulling her back against him. He couldn't let them see. He couldn't let them see their mother like this, hair a tangled web of seaweed and silt, her skin the color of ash, her lips a terrifying shade of blue. "Stay back," Joon-Hyuk growled, but his voice lacked its usual steel. It was thick with a desperate, burgeoning terror. He stepped forward, his boots squelching in the deep mud, ignoring the protests of his security detail. Min-ho tried to intercept him, reaching out a hand to stop his boss from getting too close to the medical perimeter. But Joon-Hyuk fixed him with a look so lethal that the younger man's hand froze mid-air. Joon-Hyuk pushed past the cordon of police and paramedics until he was standing directly over the stretcher. The world tilted on its axis. It was her. 7 years had passed, but time had no power over the way her face was etched into his soul. Naomi Carter, the woman who had been the only sun in his dark, violent universe. The woman he had pushed away because he was a coward who feared that loving her was a death sentence for them both. She was motionless. A paramedic was rhythmically pumping her chest, the mechanical sound of the compressions echoing the frantic beating of Joon-Hyuk's own heart. Another medic held an oxygen mask over her face, her eyes closed as if she were merely sleeping, but the stillness of her body was deafening. "Is she breathing?" Joon-Hyuk demanded. The question felt like a confession. The paramedic didn't look up, his focus entirely on the life-saving rhythm. "We have a faint pulse, but she's been submerged too long. We need to move. Now." Joon-Hyuk felt a cold, sharp blade of guilt twist in his gut. While he had been standing on the shore, frozen by the shock of his children's voices, she had been down there in the dark, silent water, fighting the current that had tried to steal her from the world. She had saved the twins. He knew it without being told. She had kept them afloat, sacrificed her own air, her own strength, to ensure they survived until he could reach them. Even in the end, she was still protecting them from the shadow of his life. "Get her to St. Mary's," Joon-Hyuk ordered, his voice returning to the low, commanding rumble that made men tremble. He turned to Min-ho, who was standing just outside the circle. "Clear the roads. Every intersection from here to the hospital is to be blocked. If that ambulance taps its brakes once, I want heads on pikes. Go!" Minho scrambled, barking into his radio. The efficiency of the Dragon King's empire shifted into a new, singular gear: the survival of Naomi Carter. As the paramedics hoisted the stretcher into the back of the ambulance, the twins began to wail. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated grief that tore through Joon-Hyuk's armor. He looked down at Noah and Nia, seeing the reflection of his own soul in their tear-streaked faces. They weren't just the Dragon King's heirs. They were hers. They were the living proof of a love he had tried to deny, a love that had survived 7 years of silence and a shipwreck. "She's going to be okay," Joon-Hyuk whispered, though he had never felt less sure of anything in his life. He climbed into the back of his armored SUV, the twins still tucked under his arms. He didn't care about the mud soaking into the expensive leather seats. He didn't care about the blood on his hands. The motorcade roared to life, a line of black vehicles screaming through the rain-slicked streets of the harbor district. Joon-Hyuk stared out the window at the ambulance ahead of them, his mind a whirlwind of memories. He saw Naomi the way she was that last night. The smell of her perfume, the warmth of her skin, the way she had looked at him with a mix of pity and love when he told her he couldn't be the man she needed. He had thought he was being noble. He had thought he was a king protecting his queen by banishing her from the kingdom of shadows. But as he looked at the 2 shivering children beside him, he realized he had been nothing but a thief. He had stolen 7 years of their lives. He had stolen 7 years of being a father. And most of all, he had stolen the chance for Naomi to have a partner in the struggle of raising them. "Daddy," Noah whispered, his voice small against the hum of the engine. "Is Mummy going to wake up?" Joon-Hyuk looked at the boy, his son. He saw his own jawline, his own stubborn brow, but the eyes were all Naomi. They were full of a hope that Joon-Hyuk felt completely unqualified to protect. "She has to," Joon-Hyuk said, his voice cracking. He reached out, his large, scarred hand gently stroking the boy's wet hair. "She's the strongest person I've ever known. The water couldn't take her. Nothing can take her from us now." But deep down, the Dragon King was terrified. He knew how his world worked. He knew that the moment he stepped into that hospital, the clock would start ticking. His enemies would hear of this. The Kim faction, the restless lieutenants, the vultures who had been waiting for a crack in his armor. They would all see Naomi and the twins as targets. He had saved them from the river, but he was about to lead them into a much deadlier storm. As the SUV pulled into the emergency bay of the hospital, Joon-Hyuk saw the medical team rushing Naomi's stretcher through the sliding doors. He watched the doors close behind her, a barrier of glass and steel separating him from the woman who held the keys to his redemption. He stepped out of the car, the rain still lashing at his face, and looked up at the sterile, white lights of the hospital. He was a man who had built a throne on a mountain of bodies, a man who had never known the meaning of the word home. But as he clutched his children's hands and followed the stretcher into the building, he knew that his empire meant nothing if that woman didn't open her eyes. The Dragon King had his children. He had his power. But as he stood in the hallway, watching the doctors disappear into the trauma room, he realized he was still the same drowning man he had been 7 years ago, and Naomi was the only one who could pull him to the shore. The sterile, biting scent of antiseptic and bleach replaced the salt air of the harbor, but the chill remained rooted deep in Kang Joon-Hyuk's bones. He stood in the private observation room of St. Mary's Hospital, his wet, ruined suit finally replaced by a dark, heavy robe the staff had scrambled to provide. Through the thick glass pane, he watched the rhythmic hiss and click of the ventilator keeping Naomi Carter alive. She looked so small amidst the forest of tubes and wires, a fragile ghost of the woman who had once challenged the Dragon King with nothing but a smile and a stubborn heart. In the corner of the room, tucked into an oversized hospital chair, Noah and Nia had finally succumbed to exhaustion. They were wrapped in thick fleece blankets, their breathing synchronized in the heavy sleep of the traumatized. Joon-Hyuk glanced at them, a foreign ache tightening his chest, before his eyes fell upon the small pile of personal effects the nurses had gathered from Naomi's soaked clothing. There was a water-damaged wallet, a set of keys, and a silver locket on a snap chain. He picked up the locket. It was heavy, made of a tarnished silver that suggested it had been worn against someone's skin for a very long time. The metal was still cold from the river. With a hand that had pulled triggers and signed death warrants without a tremor, Joon-Hyuk fumbled with the tiny clasp. It resisted him at first, jammed by a grain of harbor sand. But then it clicked open, revealing a secret he was entirely unprepared to witness. Tucked into the left side of the locket was a tiny, hand-cut photograph. It wasn't a picture of the twins. It wasn't a picture of her parents. It was him. It was a shot taken from years ago, during the 1 week they had escaped the city to a small cottage on the coast of Jeju. In the photo he was laughing. A genuine, unguarded expression that he had long ago forgotten how to wear. He looked young, he looked happy, and most importantly, he looked like a man who had a future. Across from it, on the right side of the locket, Naomi had written 4 words in tiny, careful script that the water had partially bled into the paper. Asterisk, my king, our light. Asterisk. Joon-Hyuk felt the air leave his lungs. He sank into a chair, the silver locket biting into his palm as he squeezed it shut. For 7 years, he had lived under the delusion that he was the victim of a clean break. He had told himself that by pushing her away, he had erased himself from her life, allowing her to start fresh, untainted by the blood on his hands. He had imagined her forgetting his face, replacing his memory with someone safe, someone kind. Instead, she had carried him in a locket over her heart. She had kept the Dragon King, the monster she had every right to hate, preserved like a saint. She hadn't just remembered him. She had curated his memory for their children. She had taken the blackest parts of his soul and painted them with gold for Noah and Nia, ensuring that the first father they ever knew was a hero in a photograph rather than a ghost in the dark. "Why, Naomi?" he whispered to the silent room, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you just let me stay dead to you?" The weight of her devotion was more crushing than the depth of the harbor. She had lived in exile, likely struggling to make ends meet, moving from place to place to stay off the grid of his enemies, all while raising 2 children who looked exactly like him. She had chosen a life of hardship and solitude over a life of luxury with him, simply because she knew that his world would eventually consume them. And yet, she had never let his light go out in their hearts. He looked at the twins again. He finally understood why they hadn't screamed when he grabbed them in the water. They hadn't seen a terrifying stranger. They had seen the man from the locket. They had seen the king their mother told them stories about. Every night, while he was out expanding his empire, ordering hits, and securing territories, Naomi was sitting in a small room somewhere, showing 2 little children a picture of a man who didn't deserve their love. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. Min-ho entered, his expression guarded. The second-in-command looked at the children, then at the locket in Joon-Hyuk's hand. He knew better than to ask, but the tension in the room was a physical weight. "Boss," Min-ho whispered, "the internal security report is in. There's chatter in the Kim faction. They've picked up on the hospital lockdown. They don't know about the children yet, but they know you've brought a woman here. They're calling her the Dragon's Weakness." Joon-Hyuk's thumb traced the edge of the silver locket. The Kim faction, old men who valued tradition and bloodlines above all else. If they discovered that Naomi was the mother of his heirs, they wouldn't just call her a weakness. They would call her a target. They would see the twins as the ultimate leverage to force the Dragon King off his throne. "Let them chatter," Joon-Hyuk said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying hum. He stood up, his height dominating the small room. He moved to the bed, looking down at Naomi's pale face. He reached out, his finger gently tracing the line of her jaw. "They think she is my weakness. They have no idea that she is the only reason I haven't burnt their world to ash already." He tucked the locket into the pocket of his robe, the metal warming against his hip. He felt a new kind of power surging through him. Not the cold, hollow power of the syndicate, but a fierce, burning purpose. For 7 years, he had been a man with nothing to lose, which made him dangerous. But now, he was a man with everything to protect, which made him unstoppable. "Triple the guard," Joon-Hyuk ordered, never taking his eyes off Naomi. "I want snipers on the roof of every building within a 3-block radius. I want the hospital staff on this floor vetted again. If anyone so much as looks at this room without authorization, kill them. No questions. No warnings." Min-ho bowed, his eyes wide. He had seen Joon-Hyuk in many states. Angry, calculating, bored, but he had never seen him like this. This wasn't a boss giving an order. This was a god declaring a sanctuary. And Minho? Yes, boss. Bring me the contents of her wallet. I want to know where they've been living. I want to know every person she's spoken to, every place she's worked, and every person who has ever been a threat to her. If she so much as had a landlord who was rude to her, I want them found. Joon-Hyuk turned back to the twins, who were stirring in their sleep. Nia let out a small, soft whimper, her hand reaching out into the empty air. Joon-Hyuk sat on the edge of the chair and let her small fingers close around his own. The grip was tiny, but it anchored him to the earth. He looked at the photo in his mind, the laughing man on the balcony. That man was gone, killed by the years and the blood. But as he sat there in the silence of the hospital, holding his daughter's hand and watching over the woman who had carried his memory through the storm, he realized that he didn't need to be that man again. He just needed to be the man she believed he was. He would be the king she told them about. He would be the shield against the shadows. Naomi had kept him alive in the hearts of his children. Now he would keep her alive in the heart of his empire. The Dragon King had found his treasure, and heaven help anyone who tried to take it back. The rhythmic, artificial hiss of the ventilator in the sterile hospital room began to fade, replaced in Kang Joon-Hyuk's mind by the soft, rhythmic patter of rain against a floor-to-ceiling window in a penthouse overlooking Seoul. The memory was 7 years old, but it hit him with the force of a physical blow. In the reflection of the glass back then, he had seen a younger version of himself, a man whose suit was perfectly tailored but whose eyes were already becoming hollowed out by the demands of the throne. Naomi had been sitting on the edge of their bed, her hair draped over her shoulders like a curtain of dark silk. She had been smiling, a small, hopeful thing that had made his chest ache even then. She had been talking about the future. Not the future of the syndicate, not the next territory to be seized, but a future that involved a house with a garden, a name that didn't carry the weight of 100 deaths, and a life that belonged only to them. Joon-Hyuk, she had whispered, her voice like velvet against the harshness of his world. I saw a dress today, in that little shop on the corner, the white one with the lace. I kept thinking about what it would feel like to walk toward you in it. He had stood there, his back to her, his hands clenched into fists in his pockets. He remembered the cold weight of the handgun tucked into the small of his back, a constant reminder of the life he led. Every word she spoke was a beautiful dream that he knew he was about to shatter. He had felt the walls of his empire closing in on him that day. A rival faction had just sent him a warning, a severed finger of one of his lieutenants, and the message was clear. Anyone close to the Dragon King was a target. Don't, Naomi, he had said, his voice flat, drained of the warmth he usually reserved only for her. She had paused, the smile faltering but not yet gone. Don't what? Dream? I'm allowed to dream, aren't I? We could have a life, Joon-Hyuk. A real one. I don't care about the money or the power. I want a family. I want to see a version of you that doesn't have to carry a weapon to the dinner table. He had finally turned around, his face a mask of calculated ice. He needed to be cruel. He needed to make her hate him because if she didn't leave him, she would die with him. That was the law of the underworld. The Dragon King's queen was nothing but a high-value hostage in the eyes of his enemies. There is no real life for me, Naomi, he had spat, the words tasting like ash. You're talking about marriage? About kids? Look at me. Look at what I do. I am a man who kills for a living. I am a man who wakes up every morning wondering which of my brothers is going to put a bullet in my head. You want to bring a child into that? You want to hand my enemies the perfect leash to put around my neck? Naomi had stood up then, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. We could leave. You have enough money. We could go somewhere they can't find us. We could change our names. I am the Dragon King, he had roared, the sound echoing off the expensive glass walls. There is no leaving. There is no happily ever after. I don't want a wife to worry about when I'm in a warehouse at 3 a.m. I don't want kids who will grow up to be orphans because their father was too greedy to keep his hands off a throne. I don't want them, Naomi. I don't want any of it. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. He watched the light die in her eyes. It was a slow, agonizing transformation, from the woman who loved him to a woman who finally saw the monster the rest of the world feared. "You don't want us?" she had asked, her voice trembling. "I want to be untouchable," he had lied, his heart screaming at him to stop. "And you? You make me touchable. You make me weak. I don't want marriage. I don't want children. If you're looking for a father and a husband, you're in the wrong house. You need to leave, Naomi. Now, before I stop caring about your safety and start caring about my reputation." He remembered the way she looked at him in that final moment. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, soul-deep disappointment. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply nodded, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. She had walked past him, her shoulder brushing his, and for a second, he almost reached out. He almost grabbed her and told her it was all a lie, that he loved her more than the empire, more than his life. But he hadn't. He had stood there like a statue, watching the door close. He had convinced himself that he was being a hero. He thought that by breaking her heart, he was saving her life. He looked over at the twins, still asleep in the corner. He realized that the life he had once called a weakness was actually the only thing that gave him any real strength. He wasn't just fighting for territory anymore. He was fighting for a chance to take back those words. He was fighting for a future where he could look Noah and Nia in the eye and tell them that they weren't a leash, they were his life. But as he sat there, the weight of the silver locket in his pocket reminded him of the reality outside these walls. The Kim faction was moving. His lieutenants were questioning his focus. The world of the Dragon King was built on the perception of total, cold-blooded ruthlessness. By bringing Naomi and the children here, he had signaled to every predator in the city that he finally had something to lose. He straightened his back, his eyes turning back into the hard, obsidian shards that his enemies feared. The flashback was over. The past was a scar, but the future was a war. He would not be the man who pushed her away this time. He would be the man who stood between his family and the rest of the world, and he would show the syndicate that the only thing more dangerous than a man with nothing to lose is a father with everything to protect. "Wake up, Naomi," he breathed, his voice a vow. "Wake up so I can show you that the king has finally come home." The transition from the chaos of the harbor to the sterile silence of St. Mary's Hospital was a blur of high-speed transit and suppressed panic. But once the double doors of the private surgical wing hissed shut, Kang Joon-Hyuk's transformation into the Dragon King was complete. He stood in the center of the polished marble corridor, the flickering fluorescent lights casting sharp, jagged shadows across his exhausted face. He was no longer a man shivering from the harbor's chill. He was a commander preparing for a siege. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was his new headquarters, and he intended to turn every square inch of it into an impregnable fortress. Min-ho stood a respectful distance away, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, frantic murmur as he coordinated the arrival of the inner circle. Within 30 minutes of their arrival, the hospital's normal security staff had been politely but firmly relieved of their duties on the 10th floor. In their place stood men in sharp, dark suits with tactical earpieces and the unmistakable silhouettes of concealed firearms beneath their jackets. Joon-Hyuk watched them move with the practiced efficiency of a private army, flanking the elevators and securing the stairwells. "I want a full blackout on this floor's digital footprint," Joon-Hyuk commanded, his voice echoing off the white-tiled walls like a low roll of thunder. "Cut the external feeds to the security cameras. I want our own closed-circuit loop. If a fly crosses the perimeter of this wing, I want to know its heartbeat." Min-ho nodded, typing rapidly into a tablet. "The Kim faction is already moving, boss. Our scouts spotted 2 of their vehicles circling the main entrance. They're testing the waters. They know you didn't go to the warehouse after the harbor incident. They're putting the pieces together." Joon-Hyuk's jaw tightened. He looked toward the heavy wooden door of Naomi's trauma room. Inside, she was a mess of tubes and monitors, her life hanging by a thread thinner than the silver chain of the locket in his pocket. Next door, in a secure lounge, Noah and Nia were being watched by his most trusted personal bodyguards. The twins were the only innocent things in a building currently crawling with killers, and the weight of that responsibility was a physical pressure on Joon-Hyuk's lungs. Let them test the waters, Joon-Hyuk said, his eyes narrowing into obsidian slits. They'll find that the water here is deep enough to drown them all. I want snipers on the roof of the north and south wings. I want the basement parking garage gated and guarded by a 6-man team. Nobody enters this hospital without a biometric scan that matches our database. I don't care if it's a doctor, a nurse, or the man delivering the oxygen tanks. If they don't have the clearance, they stay outside. If they push, they stay in the morgue. The scale of the lockdown was unprecedented, even for a man of Joon-Hyuk's resources. He was effectively kidnapping a section of a major metropolitan hospital, but he had the politicians and the police chiefs in his pocket deep enough to ensure that the official reports would simply cite a high-security government transport or a private medical emergency. The real battle wouldn't be with the law. It would be with the vultures of the underworld who smelled blood in the water. Joon-Hyuk walked the length of the hallway, checking every fire exit and service closet himself. He was meticulous, his mind mapping out every possible entry point for an assassin. He ordered the windows of Naomi's room to be reinforced with ballistic film and the curtains drawn tight. He had a secondary power generator brought up to the floor, ensuring that even if his enemies cut the building's power, the machines keeping Naomi alive would never falter. As he reached the end of the hall, he stopped at the door where the twins were staying. He cracked it open just an inch. Noah was sitting on a sofa, his small face pale and determined, holding a plastic cup of water for Nia, who was still trembling in her sleep. One of Joon-Hyuk's men, a scarred veteran named Hwan who had survived 3 separate assassination attempts, was sitting in a chair nearby, his hand resting near his holster. Hwan looked up at Joon-Hyuk and gave a grim, silent nod. The message was clear: over my dead body. Joon-Hyuk closed the door softly, a lump forming in his throat. He had spent his life building walls to keep people out, but for the first time he was building a wall to keep something in. He was protecting a future he hadn't believed he deserved. "Boss," Min-ho whispered, approaching him again. "The hospital director is downstairs. He's complaining about the disruption to the other patients. He's threatening to call the board." Joon-Hyuk turned, his expression so devoid of humanity that Min-ho flinched. "Tell the director that if he says another word, I will buy this entire hospital by sunrise, fire the board, and turn his office into a storage closet for cleaning supplies. Then tell him that for every hour my family is kept safe and stable, I will double the hospital's endowment. He can choose to be a hero or a memory. Tell him to choose quickly." As Min-ho hurried away to deliver the ultimatum, Joon-Hyuk returned to the chair outside Naomi's room. He sat down, the heavy robe feeling like a suit of armor. He was the Dragon King in his fortress, surrounded by his knights, but he felt a cold dread that no amount of firepower could erase. He knew his men. He knew that some of them were loyal to the paycheck, not the person. He knew that the Kim faction would try to find a crack in the foundation. A bribe, a threat to a guard's family, a weak link in the chain of command. He pulled the silver locket from his pocket and stared at the photo of his younger, happier self. He realized that by turning this hospital into a fortress, he had made it the most visible target in Korea. He was standing on the mountaintop holding a lightning rod. But as he looked at the door behind which Naomi lay, fighting for every breath, he knew he would do it all again. He stayed there for hours, a silent sentinel in the hallway, his ears tuned to the hum of the machines and the hushed clicks of his men's tactical gear. He watched the sun begin to bleed over the horizon through a distant window, the sky turning a bruised purple. The first night of the siege was over, but the war was only beginning. He could feel the tension in the air, a static charge that told him his enemies were no longer circling. They were preparing to strike. The Dragon King had built his fortress. He had secured his treasures. Now he waited for the world to try and take them from him. His eyes remained fixed on the elevator doors at the end of the long, white hall, waiting for the red light to signal an arrival. He didn't know who would come through those doors first, a doctor with good news or an assassin with a silencer, but he knew one thing for certain. Whoever it was would have to go through him first. And the Dragon King was not in the mood for mercy. The Predator's world is governed by a singular, cruel physics. Any sign of warmth is perceived as a drop in temperature, and any display of mercy is a scent of blood in the water. For Kang Joon-Hyuk, the sterile, silent halls of St. Mary's Hospital had become a temporary sanctuary, but outside those reinforced glass windows, the city of Seoul was beginning to howl. The Dragon King, a man whose legend was built on the foundation of having nothing to lose, had suddenly revealed a heart. To the vultures circling his empire, this wasn't a humanizing moment. It was a strategic opening. In the dimly lit offices of the Kim faction, maps of the hospital were being spread across mahogany tables, and silent men were checking the action on high-caliber rifles. The news had traveled through the underworld like a wildfire through dry brush. It started as a whisper from a compromised dock worker at the harbor, then grew into a frantic rumor among the low-level street runners, until it reached the ears of the high-ranking syndicates. Joon-Hyuk hadn't just saved 2 children. He had claimed them, and he had brought a woman back from the dead to guard her bedside. Joon-Hyuk sat in the dim light of the ICU's private waiting area, the silver locket heavy in his pocket, feeling the static charge of the approaching storm. He didn't need a report to know the vultures were circling. He could feel their eyes on the building. The very air in the hospital felt pressurized, as if the building itself were holding its breath before a violent exhaling. Min-ho entered the room, his footsteps hurried, his face a mask of grim urgency. He didn't wait for permission to speak. "It's leaked, boss. All of it," Min-ho whispered, leaning in so the 2 guards at the door wouldn't hear the tremor in his voice. "The Kim faction has put a bounty on the Dragon's heirs. They aren't just looking for leverage anymore. They want to erase your bloodline before it can take root. They've hired the White Spider Cell mercenaries, not street thugs. Professional killers who don't care about the collateral damage of a hospital." Joon-Hyuk didn't blink. He slowly stood up, the movement fluid and dangerous, like a wolf rising from a nap. He looked through the glass at Naomi, whose chest was still rising and falling to the rhythmic click of the ventilator. Behind her, in the adjoining room, he could see the small, blanketed lumps of Noah and Nia. They were sleeping, unaware that their names were currently being discussed as targets in the darkest corners of the city. "Let them come," Joon-Hyuk said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to rattle the window panes. "The White Spider Cell thinks they are ghosts, but they've never hunted a man who has something to live for. They are used to fighting for money. I am fighting for the only 2 reasons I have left to breathe." He turned to Min-ho, his eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light. "Double the bounty on the heads of the Kim elders. I want them to spend their last hours wondering which of their own men is going to slit their throats for a payout. But more importantly, I want a complete lockdown of the hospital's logistics. They will try to come in through the service routes. The laundry chutes, the oxygen delivery, the morgue transport. Every entry point is a throat we need to guard." The coordinated strike began not with a bang, but with a series of subtle, calculated disruptions. In the basement of the hospital, the main power grid took a sudden, massive surge, forcing the building to flicker before the emergency generators kicked in with a dull roar. On the 6th floor, a fire alarm was pulled, sending a wave of panicked patients and staff into the stairwells, creating the very chaos a tactical team needs to mask their movement. Joon-Hyuk felt the shift in the atmosphere immediately. He pulled a compact, blackened handgun from his waistband and checked the chamber with a practiced flick of his wrist. He looked at his men in the hallway, the elite guard he had handpicked. They were ready, their faces hardened into masks of stone, but he saw the flicker of doubt in some of their eyes. They were loyal to the Dragon King, but were they ready to die for a secret family? "Listen to me." Joon-Hyuk's voice cut through the sound of the distant fire sirens. Every man turned to him. "Today you aren't just guarding a boss. You are guarding a future. You are guarding the only innocent blood left in this city. If you stand with me today, you are family. If you falter, you are already dead. Hold the elevators. Guard the stairwells. Anyone who isn't wearing a badge I've personally authorized is to be dropped on sight." A frantic call came over the radio. "Boss, we have movement in the north stairwell. For men, tactical gear, gas masks. They've bypassed the 5th floor checkpoint. Seal the wing." Joon-Hyuk roared. He sprinted toward the room where the twins were sleeping, bursting inside just as Noah was sitting up, rubbing his eyes in confusion at the flashing red emergency lights. Nia was whimpering, clutching her stuffed toy. Joon-Hyuk didn't say a word. He simply grabbed them both, pulling them into the center of the room away from the windows. "Daddy? What's happening?" Noah asked, his voice trembling. "The monsters are trying to get in, Noah," Joon-Hyuk said, his voice surprisingly soft as he knelt before his son. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the frantic beat of a heart that was his own. "But remember what I told you at the harbor? I'm the strongest man in the world, and I'm not going to let a single one of them touch you." He looked at the door. He could hear the muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire in the hallway. His men were engaged. The vultures had stopped circling and had begun their descent. The hospital, once a place of sterile silence, was now a battlefield. Joon-Hyuk could hear the heavy boots of the white spider mercenaries echoing against the linoleum, a rhythmic drumbeat of approaching death. He stood up, standing between the bed where his children cowered and the door. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a shield. He was the Dragon King, and his horde was the only thing that mattered. He felt a strange sense of clarity, a violent peace that he hadn't felt in 7 years. He had spent so long running from the responsibility of love, but now that it was here, it felt like the only weapon he truly knew how to wield. Outside, the city watched as the lights of the 10th floor flickered and died. To the world, it was a technical glitch. To the Kim faction, it was the beginning of the end for their rival. But as Joon-Hyuk raised his weapon, his eyes fixed on the handle of the door, he knew that the vultures had made a fatal mistake. They thought they were attacking a man with a weakness. They didn't realize they were attacking a man who had finally found his reason to destroy them all. The door handle turned. The first of the gas-masked figures kicked the door open, a flashbang grenade in hand. But before the device could leave the mercenary's fingers, Joon-Hyuk fired. The shot was precise, a single leaden punctuation mark on a 7-year sentence of silence. The battle for the dragon's heirs had begun, and the Dragon King was ready to burn everything to keep them safe. The flashbang grenade detonated with a bone-shattering roar, but Kang Joon-Hyuk had already pulled the twins beneath the heavy oak frame of the hospital bed, shielding their small bodies with his own. White light seared the periphery of his vision, and a high-pitched ring threatened to deafen him. But the Dragon King didn't need his ears to hunt. He moved by instinct, a shadow born of smoke and silver. As the first mercenary from the white spider cell breached the threshold, his silhouette framed by the red emergency strobes of the hallway, Joon-Hyuk fired. The suppressed bark of his weapon was a rhythmic punctuation mark in the chaos. One shot to the chest, one to the throat. The intruder collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. "Stay down. Don't look up," Joon-Hyuk commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that bypassed the children's panic and went straight to their primal need for safety. Noah was clutching Mia so tightly their knuckles were white, his eyes wide and reflecting the strobing crimson lights. Joon-Hyuk didn't have time to comfort them with words. He could only comfort them with the wall of lead he was about to build between them and the door. He surged to his feet, pivoting as a second shadow appeared in the doorway. This one was faster, diving behind a medical cart and opening fire. Bullets ripped through the pillows and shattered the glass of the 4 stands, raining crystalline shards down like lethal snow. Joon-Hyuk felt a sharp, burning sting across his shoulder. A grazing shot, but he didn't flinch. In his world, pain was merely information. It told him where the enemy was. He kicked the heavy medical monitor toward the door, creating a momentary distraction, and used the split second to vault over the end of the bed. He caught the mercenary mid-reload, his large, scarred hand crushing the man's windpipe before he could scream. With a brutal efficiency that Naomi had never seen and would have hated, he twisted, using the dying man's body as a meat shield as a third assassin opened fire from the hall. The air in the room grew thick with the metallic tang of spent brass and the acrid scent of ozone. Outside in the corridor, the sounds of a full-scale war were erupting. He could hear Minho's voice barking orders, punctuated by the heavy, rhythmic thuds of high-caliber rifles. His men were holding, but the white spider cell wasn't interested in a fair fight. They were here for the bloodline. "Boss, the north elevator is compromised. They're coming up the service shaft." Minho's voice crackled over the discarded radio on the floor. Joon-Hyuk's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked at the twins, then through the glass partition at Naomi. Her room was silent, the machines still hissing their rhythmic promise of life, but she was a sitting duck. He realized then that the hospital wing had become a killbox. To stay was to die. To move was to gamble everything. "Hwan, get in here!" Joon-Hyuk roared. The scarred veteran burst through the side door, his tactical vest shredded but his eyes blazing. "They've breached the sublevel, boss. The Kim faction sent everything they have. They aren't trying to kidnap them anymore. They're trying to level the floor." "Change of plans," Joon-Hyuk said, his eyes turning into obsidian shards. "We're going to the roof. Signal the pilot. I don't care if the weather is a Category 5. If that chopper isn't on the pad in 3 minutes, I'll kill him myself." Joon-Hyuk scooped Nia up with his left arm, locking her against his hip, and grabbed Noah's hand with a grip that promised he would never let go. He looked at Naomi's room one last time. He couldn't move her, not yet. The machines were too heavy, the risk of her heart stopping too great. "Hwan, stay with her," Joon-Hyuk ordered, the words tasting like poison. "If they get past me, you are the last thing they see. Do you understand?" "With my life, boss," Hwan vowed, taking a defensive position by Naomi's door. Joon-Hyuk stepped into the hallway, and the world became a blur of motion and violence. The Dragon King was no longer a man. He was a force of nature. He moved through the corridor with the twins, his gun arm an extension of his will. Every time a door opened or a shadow shifted, he fired. He wasn't thinking about the money, the power, or the syndicate. He was thinking about the way Nia's hair smelled like hospital soap and the way Noah's hand was trembling in his. They reached the heavy steel door of the service stairs. 2 mercenaries stepped out from the shadows, their rifles raised. Joon-Hyuk didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, shielding the twins with his body, and emptied the rest of his magazine in a blinding arc of precision. The men fell, their blood splashing against the white-tiled walls, a stark, crimson reminder of the price of his sins. They sprinted up the stairs, the air growing colder as they neared the roof. The wind howled through the stairwell, carrying the scent of rain and jet fuel. When they burst onto the helipad, the storm was waiting for them. The rain was a torrential curtain, and the wind threatened to rip the twins from his grasp. In the distance, the lights of the city flickered, unaware of the slaughter occurring on the 10th floor of St. Mary's. The helicopter was there, its rotors beginning to churn the heavy air into a whirlwind. But as they raced toward the open door, a red laser dot danced across Noah's chest. Joon-Hyuk's blood turned to ice. Sniper. Without a second thought, he threw himself and the children onto the wet concrete. A high-velocity round whined overhead, shattering a nearby vent pipe. Joon-Hyuk scanned the horizon, his eyes locking onto the dark silhouette of the adjacent parking garage. He didn't have a rifle. He had a handgun and a dying magazine. "Get in the chopper. Go!" he screamed at the kids, shoving them toward the waiting hands of his flight medic. "Daddy, no!" Nia shrieked, her voice lost in the roar of the engines. "Go!" As the twins were hauled into the safety of the armored cabin, Joon-Hyuk stood up. He was a lone figure on a rain-swept roof, a target painted in charcoal against a gray sky. He fired 3 shots toward the sniper's nest, not to kill but to suppress, to buy the pilot the seconds he needed to lift off. Another round caught Joon-Hyuk in the side, spinning him around. He hit the ground, the cold rain washing over his face. He watched as the helicopter rose into the air, banking sharply away from the hospital. He saw the twins' faces pressed against the glass, their mouths open in silent screams. They were safe. The bloodline would continue. Joon-Hyuk lay on his back, the blood pooling beneath him, mixing with the rainwater. He looked up at the dark clouds, a strange, tired smile touching his lips. He had spent his life afraid of being weak, afraid of having a soft spot. But as the darkness began to creep into the edges of his vision, he realized that he had never been stronger than the moment he chose them over himself. The Dragon King was bleeding out on a roof in Seoul, but for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't alone. He had a family, and he would crawl through hell itself to get back to them. Below him, the hospital was silent. The vultures had failed. The water was still deep, but the dragon had learned how to swim. The white light of the hospital room was no longer the blinding, clinical glare of a battlefield. It had softened into the pale, honeyed amber of a new dawn. Kang Joon-Hyuk sat in a heavy chair pulled tight against the side of the bed, his body a map of fresh bandages and deep-seated exhaustion. His side throbbed with every breath, a reminder of the sniper's bullet that had nearly ended his story on the rooftop. But the pain was distant, secondary to the weight of the two small heads resting against his chest. Noah and Nia were fast asleep, their breathing rhythmic and deep, anchored by the presence of the man they had only ever known from a faded photograph. Joon-Hyuk's eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were fixed on Naomi. The ventilator had been removed hours ago, and she was breathing on her own, slow, steady inhalations that filled the silence of the room. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers grazing her knuckles. He had spent the last 3 days in a state of hypervigilance that would have broken a lesser man, refusing to leave this room even to sleep, his hand never more than an inch away from the weapon hidden beneath his robe. The flutter of her eyelids was so subtle he almost missed it. He held his breath, the world narrowing down to the tiny movement. Naomi's eyes opened, slowly, painfully, wandering the sterile ceiling before finally finding him. For a long, terrifying minute, there was only the sound of the heart monitor's steady beep. Then, her gaze shifted down to the twins, seeing their small forms huddled against Joon-Hyuk's charcoal-colored sweater. Joon-Hyuk. Her voice was a cracked whisper, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. But to him, it was a symphony. "I'm here," he said. His voice thick with a vulnerability he no longer felt the need to hide. He squeezed her hand gently, feeling her fingers twitch in a weak attempt to return the pressure. "You're safe. They're safe. We're all here." Naomi's eyes filled with tears, silver tracks tracing the pale hollows of her cheeks. She looked at him, really looked at him. Not as the Dragon King, not as the monster who had sent her away 7 years ago, but as the man who had pulled her children from the darkness. She saw the bandages peeking through his collar, the dark circles under his eyes, and the way he held Noah and Nia as if they were the only fragile things left in a world made of stone. "You found us," she breathed, her voice trembling. I told them you would come if the world ever got too dark. I didn't know if I was lying to them, or to myself." "You weren't lying," Joon-Hyuk said, leaning forward, his forehead nearly touching hers. "I was the one living a lie. I thought I could build a world where I didn't need anyone. I thought power was a substitute for blood. I was a fool, Naomi. I spent 7 years building a throne when I should have been building a home." He looked down at the twins, who were starting to stir at the sound of their mother's voice. Nia sat up first, rubbing her eyes with a tiny fist, her face lighting up with a brilliance that rivaled the sun when she saw her mother's open eyes. "Mummy!" she squealed, scrambling over Joon-Hyuk's lap to reach for Naomi's hand. Noah was awake a second later, his expression one of pure, unadulterated relief. The room was suddenly filled with the chaotic, beautiful noise of a family reunited, the quiet sobs of a mother, the frantic questions of children, and the steady, protective presence of a father who had finally found his place. Joon-Hyuk watched them, the ice that had encased his heart for a decade finally shattering into 1,000 pieces. He realized then that the Kim faction, the syndicates, the territories, they were all shadows. This, the warmth of his daughter's laughter and the weight of his son's trust, was the only real power he had ever possessed. After the children had been settled with a meal and a promise that they wouldn't have to leave the room, the air between Joon-Hyuk and Naomi turned quiet and heavy with the things that still needed to be said. He watched her finish a cup of water, her strength returning in small, flickering increments. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steadier but laced with a lingering fear. "The people who did this, the people you were trying to protect us from, they know now, don't they? They know who we are." Joon-Hyuk stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the city. From this height, Seoul looked like a sprawling circuit board of lights and ambition. But he didn't see the city anymore. He saw a battlefield that he had finally conquered, not through fear, but through a new kind of resolve. "They know," Joon-Hyuk said, turning back to her. And they are terrified. They thought they found a weakness they could exploit. They didn't realize they had just given the Dragon King a reason to stop playing by the rules. He walked back to the bed and took both of her hands in his. He looked her directly in the eye, the cold obsidian of his gaze replaced by a burning, incandescent vow. For 7 years, you ran because you thought my name was a death sentence. You hid in the shadows because you thought I wouldn't choose you over the crown. But that ends today. I have made a decree to the council. I have told every lieutenant, every rival, and every shadow in this city that you and the children are the new law. I have dismantled the Kim faction's leadership. Those who survived the hospital are currently fleeing the country. I didn't just win a fight, Naomi. I changed the world they live in. But the danger. She started, her eyes wide. There will always be danger, Joon-Hyuk interrupted softly. But you will never face it alone again. I'm not sending you away to some safe house in another country. I'm not putting you in a gilded cage. From this moment on, where I go, you go. My fortress is your home. My men are your shield. I have spent my life making people afraid of my name. Now I will spend it making sure they are afraid of touching yours. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket, the chain now repaired with a sturdy platinum link. He draped it around her neck, the silver resting against her skin. No more running, Naomi, he whispered, his voice a vow that resonated through the room. No more hiding in small towns and showing the kids a picture of a man who isn't there. I am here. I am their father, and I am your husband, if you'll still have a monster like me. Naomi looked at the locket, then back at him, a small, tearful smile touching her lips. You aren't a monster, Joon-Hyuk. You're just a man who finally found his heart. And as for the husband part, I think the twins have already decided for me. Joon-Hyuk pulled her into a gentle embrace, mindful of her injuries. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to look over his shoulder. He wasn't the Dragon King looking for a threat. He was a man holding his world in his arms. The empire he had built was no longer a cold, empty monument to his own greed. It was a fortress for his family. As the sun climbed higher over the Seoul skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the hospital room, Kang Joon-Hyuk felt a sense of peace that no victory in the underworld could ever provide. The water had been cold, and the blood had been spilled, but the fire he had found in the eyes of his children was enough to light the way home. I promise you, he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead, they will never have to run again, because as long as I am breathing, the Dragon King will be standing at the door, and I am never letting go. The storm was over. The king had his family, and for the first time the story didn't end in blood, it began with a vow. And that is how the Dragon King finally found his true empire. I really hope you enjoyed this journey as much as I enjoyed telling it. But before you go, I want to say a huge thank you for watching. I'm always amazed by how far these stories travel. So if you haven't yet, tell me in the comments. What city and country are you listening from? I love seeing where our community is growing. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you know. Until next time.